Cool. Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for inviting me to come to a talk for Bristol JS. My name is Oliver Davies, and this talk is about Tailwind CSS, which is probably my go-to CSS framework right now. It has been for some time. So before we begin, just a fun fact that these slides are built with Tailwind as well. I use a framework called Reveal MD, which is a markdown version of Reveal JS. And as part of that, I'm including Tailwind for all the styling of these slides, which is, I think, quite interesting. The code for these are on GitHub, and I'm in the middle of doing a blog post about it if anyone wants to check these out afterwards. So a little bit about me. I'm a full stack software developer. I code mostly in PHP. I do a lot of work with Drupal, CMS, and Symfony framework. I do some work with Angular and Vue as well on the front end, but do a bit of everything really, I guess. I work with a company called Avika, so I'm based in South Wales. I work remotely, even before COVID was a thing. I did do a couple of AGs in Bristol, so I've attended a couple of Bristol JS meetups in person. I was one of the organisers of the PHP South Wales meetup, South Wales now, but Southwest then. I keep doing that. Yes, I've been quite active around the Bristol community as well, and the South Wales community. These are my links, so my website and my pages on Drupal and Twitter. Pretty much OP Davies everywhere online, so any questions or feedback afterwards, or if you want to take a look at the code examples or the slides as well, they're all on GitHub and other places, OP Davies. So yeah, as I said, I do a lot of work with Drupal, a lot of work with Symfony frameworks, but yeah, I do Vue.js, and so I did a talk at WordCamp in Bristol about Tailwind, and I used Jekyll for my own site a little while ago, and Sculpin more recently, which is a PHP static site generator. But the nice thing is I've used Tailwind with all of these frameworks and systems, which has been pretty cool. So what is Tailwind CSS? Some reason my notes aren't coming up, which is annoying, but there we go. It's a CSS framework, so similar to Bootstrap and Bulma, that type of thing. The methodology is quite different, as much as it gives you very small utility first classes, very small utility classes. In most cases, even just one line CSS rules, so things like block for display block and various paddings and things. And the idea is that you chain these together to add styling to your HTML elements. And the nice thing about this as well is that you can use this, because they're so level, you can build very custom designs that don't look anything similar at all. So you don't get that thing of, oh, that's a Bootstrap site or that's a Bulma site. Tailwind sites tend to be not distinguishable particularly at all, because of the nature of things are very sort of low level. Yeah, this is annoying. I don't know why my notes aren't showing up. There we go. I'll roll it. So it's very customizable. So you have a configuration file. Tailwind will give you a whole list of defaults behind the scenes, and then you have your own file where you can override and merge in and extend the defaults. So it is, so if you want to use Tailwind's out-of-the-box colors or padding scale or breakpoints, you can do that, or say you can override them yourself. And my interpretation of it is it's more than a CSS framework, it's an engine for design systems. So because you have this set of predefined colors and spacing and transitions and everything, you've got this list of things that you can use, and what you end up with then is not 4 pixels here, 5 pixels there, 6 pixels somewhere else. You get a much more consistent looking design because you're picking from these design system values already. Again, if you want to override them, you can, and plug in your own values there. So here are some of the examples that Tailwind gives you classes for. So these were some of the sort of original ones. So text border background colors, font size, font family, and font weight, alignment, so if you want to align something to the left or to the right or the center or justified. Padding, margin, negative margin, so there's a consistent spacing scale which apply to all of those things. Flexbox utilities for positioning things using a flexbox. You can use positioning as in static or relative or absolute. list styling, Z-index, applying opacity to things, and then some of the newer ones, things like screen reader visibility, so things like the SR-only class you've probably seen from Bootstrap. Tailwind has its own version of it now. Applying colors to your placeholders, applying styles to the nth child values, so the first child or the last child of an element. CSS grid, when Tailwind was released, everybody always wanted a CSS grid, and it was added in a little while ago, I think just prior to the 1.0 release. So yeah, it's great to see those in there. Transitions and transforms. Sorry, you might hear my dog in the background. It's bedtime here and kids are just going to bed, so you might hear kids in the background too. Spacing and dividing. These I really love. So rather than applying classes to the elements directly, you can apply them to the parent and then it will space out the children for you, which is awesome. And lots more, lots more. So here are some examples. Here's the Laravel Nova website. So Laravel Tailwind was built by Adam Wadden, who's a Laravel guy. So it's got a very big sort of uptake with the Laravel community. So one of the sites it was used to build, or they used it to build, was the Laravel Nova website, which is an admin panel for your Laravel applications. Firefox Send uses Tailwind for its styling. And then this is a version that I did. If anybody's done any work with Drupal 7 or Drupal 8, this is my clone or my rebuild of the Bartik theme, which comes by default out of the box with Drupal. So this took me about an hour or two, I think, just to do the CSS and the styling one Friday afternoon, and then had some Vue.js. I think there's some Alpine.js now in there that does some toggling of menus and things. But I think we can sort of see from here, like, look at these three, like there's no real sort of consistent look and feel. And there's not that it's a bootstrap site kind of thing, sort of feeling between these designs. So which comes back to my point of custom designs. So how do we use Tailwind? So with Tailwind, you style things by adding classes to them directly. So what you typically would do, well, the way I was taught to write CSS, the way I learned to write CSS, was you wrote your HTML, you then went to a different style sheet, to a different file, you had a style sheet, and you wrote your CSS there, and you wrote it all sort of by hand, and you'd copy the same values across multiple things, so you'd have sort of display block X number of times and padding 10 pixels X number of times or whatever. So this very much sort of switches it on its head, and you don't have the separate style sheet in some cases or most cases. And what you're doing is Tailwind gives you all the classes that you possibly could ever want to use, and then you apply them to your HTML directly. So you don't have this context switching of going from your HTML to your CSS to your HTML to your CSS. It's all, it encourages you to use the HTML as much as possible. And the other thing with this as well is that it's slightly different to the Bootstrap methodology. So it's not, again, because there's so levels, they're not so low level. It's not tightly coupled to the HTML at all. So with Bootstrap, so we've got the classes in the Bootstrap file, and you need this chunk of HTML to make it work, right? So this HTML needs to match the CSS because they're tightly coupled. But we don't have this with Tailwind at all, because everything, you can apply padding 5 to anything, basically. So yeah, slightly different methodologies to everything. That's what we're used to using. As I said, Tailwind gives you thousands of utility classes to pick from, and we can use these to apply styling to our designs without writing any CSS in most cases. Like, you can still write CSS, of course, and in some cases you'll need to, but the majority of the time you might not need to. Like those examples, the Bartik one I did doesn't have any custom CSS at all. It's all done with the out-of-the-box classes. So there are some benefits. You're not wasting time inventing class names for things. So I remember writing classes like sidebar left in a bottom wrapper or something. Like if it's a flex container, you can just apply a class of flex and it's a flex container. You don't need to think what's a good name for this thing, because naming things is hard. And that will take some time, and you can just apply flex and you're done and move on to the next thing. And then your CSS stops growing as well, because you're reusing the same classes multiple times. You're not going and writing adding a new component and writing another 100 lines of CSS. and then that's adding more load to your network tab every time you reload a page, because you're reusing the same classes multiple times. The CSS that you're using, the generating, stays the same size, possibly, ideally. And making changes feel safer. So CSS generally is global. So if you change something in your style sheet, you don't know where else that's affecting your styling elsewhere in your page. The nice thing about doing the utility class approach is HTML is local, so the opposite. So I'm much more comfortable going in and taking font bold off an element, and I'm confident now that it's only going to affect that one thing. I don't need to worry about the knock-on sort of changes. And there's like XKCD or memes with the Peter Griffin thing with the windows and things like that's not a thing anymore, because we're not going to be changing stuff elsewhere just by changing our CSS. So the next couple of slides are just some screenshots from the Tailwind CSS website itself. They're not the whole thing, so I'd encourage people to go and take a look. They may have updated it now, actually, since these are quite old. But we can hopefully get a feel here of what the workflow, how we go about using it. So on the left, we've got some code, and on the right, we've got the end result, the output there. So on the outer div, we can see we've got a class of BG white and rounded LG. So BG is background and white is white. So that's giving us a white background. And rounded LG is giving us some slightly rounded corners, so setting a border radius on our outer wrapper. And it's a little bit hard to see here, but we'll get that here in a moment. And then our image has a H16 and a W16, so height and width. And it has a value of 16. So 4 units is 1 rem, and everything is proportional from that, which is nice. So if I want to have make something twice as big, I just double the number, and that makes it twice as big. So if I want to make this half the size, I could make it H8 and W8, and it would half it.
Can I just ask something quickly from this example?
Yeah, sure.
Is it the rounded LG that's causing the text shadow? Does that kind of come as a standard thing?
There are text shadows. There are classes for shadows, but I don't see one here. So
I was wondering that, is that something you've just added yourself as part of the slideshow? Is it the drop shadow on the element?
If it's there, it's in the animation that I screenshotted. It's not necessarily the one that I've done. So it might be there. It may have changed it since I've done this. I think they've actually changed this animation now. So yeah, there is a shadow class, so we did want a box shadow as well. Yeah, good point. I hadn't noticed that before. If you want to add some padding to our cards, we add P6, so P for padding, and then a value of 6. So it's 4 is 1 rem, 6 is 1.5 rem. To make the image round, we can add rounded full, so that gives it 100% border radius on our image. We can put MX auto to add margin on the x-axis, so left and right margin auto to move it into the center. Text LG to give the H2 slightly larger text. So text, some things use like a t-shirt size scale, so small, extra small, medium, or base, large, extra large. So text uses that sort of scale rather than the numeric scale. Colors have numeric values as well, so they're obviously grouped by color, so in this case purple, and there's a scale of 100 to 900, 100 being the lightest, 900 being the darkest. So this is applying nice middle color purple here. And then we can do the same thing and apply a gray text to the rest of the text by applying gray 600. And then if you want to make the text in the center, we apply text center to move everything into the center. So there are more slides to that, and I'd say I know they changed it again recently, so they may have added some new things into Tailwind. So I'd encourage you to go and take a look at the full slideshow later on. And we'll cover some more parts of this when we get through this talk. So how do we install Tailwind? There is a CDN that we can use. So we can go to Unpackage and grab the CDN version. It is minified and it does compress really, really well, but it's big because it has everything in it. As they add more features and more things to the framework, it's probably going to get bigger. But to get the most out of Tailwind, you should install it via npm. So Tailwind is itself a PurgeCSS plugin, so we can install it via npm. Yeah, we do that just using npm install or using yarn, and the package is just called Tailwind CSS. We can add it to our dev dependencies in this example. Now we install it, we need to add Tailwind to our CSS. So we have a source file, and I tend to use PurgeCSS now for my source files as well. You can use SAS or less or some of the pre-processors. I tend to like using PurgeCSS because it's going through PurgeCSS anyway. It only has to sort of do one pass through it rather than sort of compiling the SAS or the less and then running the PurgeCSS afterwards. So the build time is probably less, but anything that I need through, like if I need nesting or something, I can add a PurgeCSS plugin for it anyway. And these at Tailwind things are custom PurgeCSS directives, which I think is the right term for it. So the 3 layers of Tailwind. The first one is the base, which is the some reset styles that pulls in normalize and some other bits and pieces there. Then some components. So essentially there's a container, which is pretty sure still the only component that it ships with. And then the utility. So all the text and the alignment and the padding things. The majority of the stuff is in that layer. Notice there's a character snuck in there. Sneaky. So if you want to add your own custom base styles or custom component styles, then the ordering of this is quite important. So to keep the specificity right, then we want to put the custom base styles after Tailwind's base styles, and then our custom components after Tailwind's components, because we may want to override base styles with component styles. And then our custom utilities come at the end, so that we may want to add a custom utility onto a component and have it override there. So maybe our card has some padding built into it, for example, and then we want to add more or less padding, and we can do that by adding a P whatever class to our card. We want it to override, and because of that, the cascade is important. That's one of the main sort of things I see people using Tailwind is they'll put these 3 placeholders at the top of their file and all the custom stuff at the bottom, and then the cascade just doesn't work. So it needs to sort of be in this order. Something I found out quite recently is this also in this layer directive, we can specify the layer in which the stuff needs to be. So I can put my custom components inside a components layer, inside the components layer. And by doing that, it will place it in the right part of the file when it comes to compile it, which is pretty cool. So I found this quite recently. And also there's some benefits to purging to do it this way as well, which we'll come on to later on. So this is inside a source file called app.pcss. And then we need to process our CSS using some sort of command. So Tailwind gives us a command called Tailwind build. We pass the path to our source file. So there's our the source file that we just saw, and then specify the output file. So we're just going to say take the source file and the PurgeCSS file, and then build a CSS file at the end. And this is a very small snippet of what we get. So we got our text left utility and our text center utility, and these are all very small 1-line CSS classes. So that's fine. You can put that into your npm build scripts or something, or if using, you could use PurgeCSS directly as well and sort of bypass that. Most times I'm using some sort of JavaScript in some of my projects as well. So maybe I'm using Vue or Angular or something. And I tend to reach for a tool called Webpack Encore. So this comes from Symfony, but it's not Symfony specific in any way. It's just a wrapper around Webpack. So we talked about Webpack a little bit earlier on, actually. So this is pretty cool. You can use tools like Gulp or Grunt, or Laravel has one called Mix, which is very, very similar. Yeah, I'm more in the Symfony camp myself, so I tend to stick to Encore where I can. And this is what my Webpack config looks like. So you can see we're setting the output path and the public path that we build. We've got an option here to add a style entry. So our style here is called app. So the file that it generates, we've got app.css. We'll pass through the path to our source file. And then we need to enable the PurgeCSS loader to be able to load and compile the PurgeCSS. We also need a PurgeCSS config file. This is just a an array of plugins. So Tailwind CSS is a PostCSS plugin. If you're going to use something like order prefixer here, you put it in this file as well, or a couple of any other PostCSS plugins like nesting or whatever, they'll go to this file as well. And then if we run Encore, we get just this confirmation message is joined to one file, which is our app.css file, which is it's big. It's got all the things inside it. And then our HTML, we just add a link to our style sheet, which is inside our build directory, and it's called app.css, and that will load our HTML and load our CSS. Okay, let's talk about interaction states. So by this, I mean things like hover, focus, active, disabled. Like they're adding new ones of these all the time as well, which is pretty cool. But this is where we start to sort of break away from sort of inline CSS, which, you know, if you want to add everything we've seen before, we can more or less do with inline CSS. So this is where things start getting fun. So the format for these are the state. So hover, for example, and then a separator. So Tailwind typically uses a colon, and it will escape that in the compiled CSS. And then the class name. So any class name that we've seen, we will see in Tailwind, we can make work, assuming it's been enabled, that is, using this format. So if you want to make something be TextRed 500 on hover, we prefix the class name with hover colon whatever. Again, everything's really customizable. So if a colon doesn't work in your project for some reason and you want to use double underscore or double dash or something, we can configure that in your config file and it will generate it as you set it. So here's what that looks like. TextRed 500 is applying this color. Hover TextRed 500. So you can see it's escaping the colon there. So I didn't realize that was a thing until Tailwind started doing it. And the same thing for focus as well. And the thing I like about this is that it means like the actual class name that it uses is consistent regardless of what interaction state or what breakpoint we use it at. Whereas things like the Bootstrap one, like if you want to do this in Bootstrap, you'd have to give it to my col MD6, and then the MD is sort of in the middle of the class name. So the class name itself changes. For me, I just like the consistency. The class name stays the same, and we're just literally prefixing it with something else. So here's how we'd use that. So TextRed 500 by default, and then when we hover over it, we use a slightly darker red, TextRed 800. So this is a sample of the default config, and we can see here that Tailwind groups everything into a set of variants or modules, as it used to call it. And we can see here that certain things here are enabled on responsive, and some things are here on states like hover and focus. So background color, we can see is available for hover and focus, which just means when Tailwind generates classes, then it will generate hover and focus versions of background colors. But in this list, nothing else in this list. We can also use responsive classes. So they follow the same pattern, but rather than an interaction state at the beginning, we prefix it with a screen. So screens are defined in our config file. These are the default screens, so small, medium, extra large, small, medium, large, extra large. And there's talk of adding a 2XL in here possibly as well. Again, these are just the defaults. If you want to have more screens, less screens, change the value from medium to be 800 or whatever, you can override this no file, which we'll look at later on. And then we just take the key from that array, so MD for medium screens, flex. We can also chain these together, so we can do responsive interaction state classes. So we can say this is going to be BGRed 500 when you hover over it on a medium screen or above, because these are all minimum width media queries. So it encourages a mobile first workflow. So yeah, this will say anything above, what was our 768. So anything above 768, we hover over it, it will be this color red. Yeah, this is the generated code again. So let's use block as an example here. So block is just display block. And then it's going to wrap these things in media queries, so minimum width media queries. So again, it's just going to escape the colon and prefix it with the name of our class. So here's an example. We can say that it's just setting some columns in some HTML. So by default on mobile, then this is going to be display block, and on medium screens and up, it's going to be display flex. So we're going to display these columns one next to each other. And then the columns themselves are be width full, so W for width, and then 100% with it being full. But on medium screens, we want them to be width 1/2, so 50% width. So it's going to move from being stacked on mobile to being next to each other on medium. Okay, so keeping things small, as I said, Tailwind generates a lot of classes for you sort of by default. I know this was sort of one of Adam's things. When he's first starting to work on this project, like he was quite against adding some new things because he was like, oh, this will just add, you know, X 100 or 1,000 more classes. But yeah, we have some control over that. So we saw some variants earlier on, and we can disable them. We can and core plugins as well that we'll see. So here's that variant list again. Let's just say in this case we don't. If we're never going to use align self, for example, we can just say false align self false, and it just won't generate any align self classes. And let's say that our background color, we don't need the hover and focus states, so we just want the responsive ones. We can take those out of the array, and it just won't generate those variants. And that will cut our generated CSS down by, you know, however many classes, probably quite a few. And we can also remove classes manually as well. So here's another snippet of the config file. So we've got some screens and some colors. And let's say on this project, we don't need XL screens. We're only going to go up as far as large, and we don't want gray 200, 400, 500, 800. So we'll just remove them from our config file. And then we just don't, Tailwind then just won't generate those classes for us. This is fine, but it does rely on us doing this manually. There could be a case for doing that if your design system says we're only going to use, you know, red, green, and blue or something, for an example. Like we already generate those classes for you, but Tailwind does also allow for automatically removing classes, and it does that using a tool called PurgeCSS. So PurgeCSS is a tool that when you build the production version of your classes, it will scan through directories and look in your files and basically say, do we use text red 500 anywhere? If no, we'll remove it. And so basically we only end up with what we've used. And this was sort of encouraged in Tailwind for, you know, quite some time. It generates, you know, a few meg of CSS view by default. So it's always sort of being encouraged, and there was various sort of recommended approaches to doing this. And there was a Laravel mix plugin that somebody did that made it a bit easier. But as of Tailwind 1.4, it's there now by default, which is pretty cool. So we don't need to, worry about it. So in this example config file, we have a purge key at the top. We can specify some paths to some directories and files we want to scan. So yeah, we need to scan our HTML and some view files. And yeah, when we're going to run it, if we don't find the class, we're just not going to generate that class, or it will get removed, more technically. So if I'm using Encore again, we can just run Encore dev, and it will generate the development version of everything. So it'll generate everything by default. So if you're working locally, you want to have all the classes available to you so you can use them. If you use this, so if you set the node environment to be production, the way that Tailwind is set up, its PurgeCSS integration, as long as that node env is equal to production, it will run the purge. And when you generate the production version, you only get the minified and the purged versions, a much, much smaller version. And as I said, it's generating, last time I checked, it's like 2 meg or something. It might be more, it might be less now, but like once you've purged it, it can be down to like some sites are like less than 10 kilobytes. I'll go that far. So it does make things much, much smaller. That's strange. It's changing here, but not changing there. Fine. So the slide that you can't see says, how do I deal with repetition? And we avoid the repetition by extracting components. Well, that's sort of the recommended approach anyway. So one of the main problems people see when they're looking at sites that use Tailwind is they just potentially just look at the source code and see all this repetition. And if you want to reuse the same components in multiple places, how can we do that without repeating all the same classes and applying the same classes over and over again? And if we want to change something, how do we do that without changing, you know, X number of versions of the same thing? So yes, we do this by extracting components. So that's the recommended approach. And the reason why it's the recommended approach is that we can extract just the CSS. We'll look at that in a minute. But most likely we need the actual structure as well. So it's no good just extracting the CSS if we don't have, you know, 3 divs and the SVGs inside the second div or whatever. So we get that if we use a component like a view partial or a twig include or something. I think a key question here though is, does something justify becoming a component? So something like a nav bar, you're only going to have one nav bar. So I'd probably just leave that inside my main file, and it's fine where that is. And yeah, could the duplication be moved elsewhere? So here's the example using twig. So this hopefully looks pretty familiar to people. This is just looping over a list of nav items. So this is from, I think it's from my site actually at one point. Just got a list of nav items, just going to loop over them and just display a list for every one of them. We can see we've got a list of classes here. We're going to make it display block and apply some padding and make the text small and make the text gray. And we can output the link and the title. But this link, we've only got this only, sorry, my kids in the background. This list of classes only appears here once. So even if you look at the HTML, like we might get 5, 10, X number of nav items, but in our development, you know, we've only got one instance of this string. So if you wanted to change the color or the padding, we can do it here once, and it will, when we rebuild everything, it will affect them all. Here's an example from a site that I was working on a while ago. This is from a martial arts class site I was building. And yeah, I just want to display a list of classes that are available, and I've extracted a class list include here, and then all the repetition is moved into that template. And all I'm doing is passing through the dynamic stuff. So I'm passing through the classes that it's using and the type. So again, we've removed this duplication because all the duplication is now moved into the one source of truth inside that include, if that makes any sense. Tailwind does offer another directive called apply. And this is very, very similar to sort of SAS extends, but works in a slightly different way. If you've used less, and you can sort of do the same thing there, and essentially use classes as mix-ins. So apply gives us the same thing. And we can essentially take any class name with a caveat, any class name that we could use. We can say @apply, and it will take the value that it would have applied if I just put this into the HTML and just add it to the link. So you can say we're adding text small and no underline, and it's bold, and et cetera, here. The one caveat right now is it can't deal with things with states. So things like hover here, currently you have to apply that separately. There's a flag, there's an experimental flag where you can say apply complex classes that was added, I think in 1.7, so fairly recently. And that does get around this issue. I've been testing it and it works really, really well. And this is what it generates. So yeah, it's going to take those values, apply them directly to the class, to this button in this case. But rather than extend, we're not going to end up with, you know, it's like 100 selectors with the same CSS. They're all sort of nicely contained there. So customizing, we can run a command called npx tailwind init. It will initialize a configuration file, a Tailwind configuration file. And something I found recently again is you can add -p, then it will generate the post-CSS config file that we saw earlier. It'll do that automatically as well. The main thing for this now is this file. This is the Tailwind config file. This is just a JavaScript object. The nice thing about this as well, like in the earlier versions of Tailwind, like when we did this, it generated everything. So like all the colors and all the spacing and everything. And it was up to you then to sort of maintain your version, your customizations and your sort of overrides and the defaults. So if they change something in Tailwind sort of upstream or in the base package, like you didn't know that, you had to go in and sort of change, like bring all those changes across yourself. So one change they made prior to the 1.0 release was the default config is done behind the scenes, and then this file gets merged on top of that file. So we have a purge, we have theme, we have an extend, we have some plugins, we have some variants. So if you want to add a new color called inherit, if you want to text, the inherit color, we can add it into the colors array inside theme. But based on where this is placed, this will just generate just the one color now. So we've overridden all the colors because it's inside the theme key directly. If you put it here inside the extend, we'll add this to Tailwind's default colors. So this is fine if you've got a design, or you've got some Photoshop files, or some whatever, or you've been given like a design system or color palette, or whatever designers want to call it these days. That's great, because then you can these are my colors, and I will Tailwind will generate only the colors that I want based on what my system is. But yeah, if you just want to extend and just add to the defaults, we can do it using the extend key. And the same thing works for everything else as well. There's a couple of other things that don't get generated here by default, but are quite useful to know. So prefix is one. If, for example, you might be using a Bootstrap already, like I am on some projects, and I've sort of layered Tailwind on top, and there's a collision, we can specify a prefix, and then when Tailwind will generate the classes, we'll add that prefix to everything. I maintain a Drupal 7 sort of base theme, starter kit theme, and there's a clash there between the block class that Tailwind generates for display block and the block class that Drupal uses in its HTML for a block in the sidebar. So typically at least in that example, I've got a prefix of TW dash, so then the Tailwind version becomes TW dash block. Then we don't get that conflict at all. And then if we want, everything is not bang important by default. So if you did want them to be, which isn't a bad idea for utility classes, we can change important to true, and it will generate them that way as well. If we did want the full file, like we did at the beginning, we can specify -- full, and it will give us the full version, everything. I've run out of water. Nice. Okay, so extending Tailwind with plugins. So there's a whole list of NPM packages again, which are plugins for Tailwind. So this is one that I maintain called List Reset. So prior to the 1.0 release, there was a class called List Reset that would remove like list styling and padding and things. It got taken away prior to the 1.0 release, but I still use it in some projects. So I made a plugin for it. So I installed it via NPM, again, like we do with Tailwind itself. And then inside the plugins key here, we've got a require. We just require the plugin. So Tailwind CSS List Reset. And this is what it does. Yeah, it just removes the list style and removes some padding. But this is what it looks like. So the plugin is written in JavaScript. So I'm just like Tailwind gives us some functions that we can use, like add utilities, and we just generate these classes in a sort of a CSS and JS type way. So our key is the class name we want to use, and then we specify everything in camel case and the values there, and then we pass through this array of variants. So these are responsive or hover, focus, whatever. So yeah, that's a really simple example of a plugin. So I'm just keeping on the time. I think we're at 40 minutes. I've done a sort of couple of examples here we can have a look at, hopefully, if I find my mouse. So yeah, I've done a few sort of rebuilds. I said the Bartik one I did a little while ago. I've done a few recently. I did this one for one of the PHP user groups that I talked about recently. So this is a clone of the Symfony framework website. So if I bring up the actual version here. So this is what the actual one looks like. And then this is what my version of it looks like. So yeah, I've copied across like the logos and some of these SVGs and things, but everything else is done using Tailwind classes. It's using sort of grid and some other things in here after this layout. My favorite thing about this one is I'm using, just find my appearance settings. Let's see, so the main Symfony site itself has a toggle somewhere for switching to dark mode. There we go, switch to dark theme. So you can click this and it changes some colors and that thing. So Tailwind is is adding or has added experimental flag for dark mode. So I did this prior to this, but I've added a dark mode thing. So if I toggle my OS here, so from light to dark, it changes as well, which is pretty cool. I do have to try and sort of rebuild sites that people sort of may be interested in. So I was going to try and do the Tech Talk site, but realized that it seems to really use Tailwind already, so I didn't do that. But what I did do is I rebuilt this version of the Bristol JS site. So this was quite interesting. I did this when I found out I was doing this talk. And again, this code is on GitHub, and I thought I'd do this as a Vue.js app, so you can sort of see how to do it in Vue, given it's a JavaScript meetup. So let's see, I've got a PurgeCSS config file. This requires Tailwind itself. Package JSON files. It's all pretty much all centered Vue. The only difference, I've added Tailwind in itself. It's around 1.8.5 when I did this, which is quite recent. Everything else in here is just standard Vue CLI things. This is my config file. So I'm using Purge. So the other option is we can specify everything as an array, or we can specify the paths as content, which then gives us some options to use other things like mode. And this is something that they're now recommending in the newer version, which I think will maybe change in the 2.0 version. So we can now purge things based on layers. So it only purged utilities, I think, in the previous versions. So we can now say purge all the layers, which is quite cool. I've done some theme overrides. So I've changed some colors to match the colors that were there before. So this is not extending. It's just we're only going to get colors to black, gray, everything. And this sort of syntax means we'll end up with a gray, text gray 5, get text gray 50 class here. What else we got? I'm overriding some font families. So I end up with a font-display and a font-body I can use. Nothing's extended here at all. I have pulled in a plugin called Tailwind CSS aspect ratio. So this is not one that I built, but one that's available at GitHub and on NPM. I am using this experimental flag for applying complex classes, and then purge layers by default means, yeah, it's going to purge more things, and our build, our production CSS is going to be quite a bit smaller. And yeah, this then is configured, see inside our theme. So yeah, I've added one aspect ratio called 16:9, which is 16:9. The main index HTML itself is, I've not touched it at all. Well, I've added these two links to the Google Fonts, but I've not added any classes in here at all. All the classes have gone into, not into main, but into app.view. So I have extracted some components, which I did say maybe I wouldn't do a nav bar, but I have in this example, just to keep things a bit clearer. So I've added, there's our font display to set our display font here, and I'm setting a default text color. We're setting a height, and this is we display flex here, and justify the items to the center, and justify the items to the center, and then justify everything to the center. You do pick this up. It does seem like a lot of classes. It is a lot of classes, but yeah, you do pick them up like really quickly. And the nice thing I like also is this is really transferable then onto the next project as well. Like some things will be slightly different, like your colors might be different or whatever. Like you wouldn't get BG yellow by default, it would BG yellow something, but in this case I've just got BG yellow. So see, I'm applying including a recent talks component. Anything interesting here to look at? So I'm using CSS grid, and then it's saying the gap is going to be a value of 8, which I calculate as being 2 rem in my mind. But on a medium screen, we want it to be grid calls 3, so we can span over 3 columns. So 1 column by default on mobile and 3 on medium. I have had to add a little bit of inline styling here. For some reason, Flex Start was doing the class Flex Start was doing Flex Start like this, which wasn't quite what I wanted. But that did work. And yeah, here I'm using this space Y, so everything, all the children here should have a space in between them on the Y-axis, so top to bottom of 6, so 1.5 rem. And because I'm overriding the flex column direction to change the ordering, I then need to reverse also the spacing, so it applies the spacing to the bottom rather than to the top. It's the way it will tend to do things to the top and the left rather than the bottom and the right. Let's see, is there anything else sort of to mention? I have duplicated some of these things. Let's see, anything worth mentioning? Pulling in, yeah, a couple of custom components here. What's worth mentioning? Let's maybe have a look at some of those here. Actually, components. Yeah, so again, there's our frequently asked component. Again, using some spacing and try to find something that's a bit interesting maybe to look at. Yeah, so here we've got a link, or all the links. So is this inside of V4 maybe? Let me see. Yeah, so yeah, V4 link and link. So this is a view version of that array that we saw earlier on. So it's going to loop over this array of links that we've got, and we're going to apply no color here by default, it looks like, but on hover and focus, we're going to make them yellow. And then there's our colors here. So based on whether or not our link is active, the classes are going to be white or yellow. And the reason why I'm putting this here rather than sort of concatenating is that so PurgeCSS will find them properly. So I could do something like text dash and then do some sort of ternary in here, but then Purge wouldn't know it was a thing. It wouldn't get purged properly. See if there's anything else particularly worth mentioning. Yeah, CSS grid here again as well. Again, this is on GitHub if people want to take a look at this afterwards as well. Though I am doing some, that's something else. So this is only available to screen readers because it's SR only. Let's see what's worth to mention. I'm sure there's some interesting things here to mention. I'll think of something afterwards. I'm like, I should have mentioned that thing, but there we go. I'll think of it afterwards. Let me see, can I find the actual CSS in here that it generates? The actual, maybe not. Okay, that's fine. Maybe I can do it on the command line here very quickly. I'll just find it. Rebuilding. Yes, so if I do, just remember what I was using. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I was going to try and find the actual code to show you how the size difference, but I can't find it and I'm running out of time. So I'll find that later on. And I'll remember what it was I wanted to show. That's why afterwards. But there we go. So interesting little demo, maybe. So some helpful links. Tailwind CSS is the main documentation website. It's all open source. If I didn't mention that already, it's all on GitHub. Tailwind UI is a set of paid UI kits where you can say I want them to use like pre-built components that it offers based on Tailwind itself, which is pretty cool. Built with Tailwind is a site that people submit their links to and sort of showcase their sites there that are built with Tailwind. Adam does some streaming on his own YouTube channel where he's rebuilding UIs and things, or working on Tailwind itself quite often. So those are pretty cool. There is an actual Tailwind Labs channel, which they've launched the last couple of weeks as well, which is pretty cool. As I said, I do maintain the Drupal base theme. I've done a few blog posts on Tailwind as well, as you can find those here, and a couple of repos. They're all tagged. Ooh, that's cool. Yeah, these are all tagged with Tailwind CSS on GitHub, so you can find sort of all the projects I've got in here that are all tagged with Tailwind that I've been using, if they're of interest. So that includes some plugins and some actual, websites like mine and some other things as well. And yeah, if you're a little bit maybe sort of apprehensive about it, this is a tweet that I saw recently from Paul, who saw me do an early version of this talk, I think at the WordCamp in Bristol. We had a bit of a discussion about it afterwards about, how, yeah. But then, yeah, he's now come back and said, yeah, I think my answer was, go and try it and sort of come back and sort of let me know what you think. And yeah, I found this. This was replying to Tailwind itself, which was pretty cool. So in the follow-up tweet, you mentioned me, which is how I found it. But yeah, if you're a bit skeptical about it, give it a try and see how you get on with it. Yeah, if you've got any time for questions, I think maybe a little bit over time there, but I'm happy to take some questions or